Karen pulled a gun in court to intimidate my daughter. She had no idea Judge was my sister. The fluorescent lights of the county courthouse buzzed overhead as Sarah clutched her daughter Emma's trembling hand. At 17, Emma shouldn't have to face this, shouldn't have to sit across from the woman who had turned their lives into a nightmare. But here they were, in Courtroom 3B, waiting for a civil hearing that felt anything but civil. Sarah's mind raced back to 6 months ago, when their neighbor, Karen Mitchell, had first complained about Emma's music being too loud. What started as a simple noise complaint had escalated into something far more sinister. Karen had filed false police reports, spread vicious rumors throughout their small community, and made their daily lives unbearable. She'd accused Emma of everything from vandalism to drug dealing, all lies, all calculated to destroy a teenage girl's reputation. Today was supposed to bring resolution. Emma had gathered the courage to file for a restraining order after Karen had confronted her in their driveway, screaming threats while Emma's younger siblings watched in terror from the window. Sarah had documented everything: the harassment, the lies, the late-night banging on their door, the slashed tires, the poisoned garden. As they sat on the hard wooden bench, Sarah noticed Karen enter the courtroom with her lawyer, a slick-suited man who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. Karen's face bore that familiar expression, smug confidence mixed with barely concealed contempt. She looked at Emma and Sarah with eyes that promised more trouble to come. What none of them knew was that today would change everything. The judge assigned to their case had just taken the bench, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Sometimes the universe has a way of evening the scales. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. Sarah remembered the exact moment their peaceful life had shattered. It was a Tuesday evening in late March when Emma had come home from school, dropped her backpack by the door, and headed upstairs to practice violin. Emma had been preparing for her state orchestra audition for months, and the music that floated through their modest two-story home had become the soundtrack of their family's hope for her future. 15 minutes into Emma's practice, their doorbell rang with an aggressive intensity that made Sarah's heart jump. When she opened the door, Karen Mitchell stood there, her face twisted with an anger that seemed disproportionate to any reasonable complaint. "That noise needs to stop right now," Karen had demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "I work from home, and I can't concentrate with that screeching." Sarah had been taken aback. They'd lived next door to Karen for 3 years without incident. Their homes were separated by a full yard on each side, and Emma always practiced with her windows closed. "I'm sorry you can hear it," Sarah had replied carefully, "but Emma's practicing for an important audition. She'll be done in another hour." "An hour? Absolutely not. If you don't stop that noise immediately, I'm calling the police." Sarah had tried to be diplomatic. She'd explained that the city's noise ordinance allowed for reasonable sounds during daytime hours, that Emma was a serious music student, and that they'd always been considerate neighbors. But Karen wasn't interested in compromise. She wanted control, and when she couldn't get it, she declared war. The police arrived 20 minutes later. The officers had been understanding, even apologetic, when they knocked on Sarah's door. They'd measured the sound levels from Karen's property and found them well within legal limits. They'd noted in their report that the music was pleasant classical violin and not excessive. But Karen had filed an official complaint anyway, and it was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, the complaints multiplied. Karen claimed that Emma's friends were dealing drugs in their driveway, a lie that prompted a humiliating search of their home. She reported that Sarah's husband, Michael, had threatened her, an accusation that was quickly disproven by their doorbell camera footage, which showed no such interaction had ever occurred. She told other neighbors that Emma was a troubled teen who'd been expelled from multiple schools, when in reality, Emma was an honor student who'd never even received attention. The harassment took its toll on Emma. She stopped inviting friends over, afraid of what Karen might accuse them of doing. Her practice sessions became shorter and more tentative, as if she was afraid to make any sound that might draw attention. Sarah watched her confident, vibrant daughter become withdrawn and anxious, jumping at every knock on the door. Michael, who worked long hours as a construction supervisor, felt helpless watching his family suffer. He tried confronting Karen directly, asking her what they could do to resolve the situation peacefully. Karen had simply smiled and told him that they could move somewhere else if they didn't like it here. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in September. Emma had been washing her car in their driveway when Karen emerged from her house and approached. Sarah had been in the kitchen and heard the raised voices. By the time she reached the front door, Karen was standing inches from Emma, screaming that she was a lying little troublemaker who was going to get what was coming to her. Emma, to her credit, had remained calm and had simply asked Karen to leave her alone. But Karen had grabbed Emma's wrist hard enough to leave bruises, her eyes blazing with an intensity that frightened even Sarah, who'd stepped between them immediately. "You're going to regret the day you moved here," Karen had hissed before storming back to her house. Emma's younger siblings, 10-year-old twins Jake and Lily, had witnessed everything from the living room window, and Lily had nightmares for weeks afterward. That night, with Emma's wrist wrapped in ice and the police report filed, Sarah and Michael had made a decision. They would fight back legally. They would document everything and pursue a restraining order. Emma deserved to feel safe in her own home. The lawyer they consulted had been honest about their chances. "Cases like these can be difficult," she'd explained. "Without physical violence or explicit threats, judges sometimes see these as neighborhood disputes that should be resolved between neighbors. But given the pattern of behavior and the false reports, you have a solid case." The months between filing the restraining order petition and the court date felt like years. Every day brought new anxieties, new ways that Karen found to make their lives difficult. She'd taken to photographing their house constantly, claiming she was documenting code violations. She'd filed a complaint with the Homeowners Association about their lawn ornaments, their holiday decorations, even the color they'd painted their shutters. Emma's audition for the state orchestra had come and gone. She performed well, but the stress of the situation at home had affected her confidence. When the acceptance letter arrived, Emma had cried tears of relief and exhaustion rather than pure joy. It was a bittersweet victory, tainted by the constant harassment that had nearly derailed everything she'd worked for. School became Emma's only refuge. Her teachers noticed the change in her usually outgoing student, but didn't know how to help. Emma's best friend, Maria, had been supportive, but even she couldn't understand the constant state of vigilance that Emma lived in. Walking to the mailbox, taking out the trash, sitting in her own backyard, everything felt dangerous now, as if Karen might appear at any moment with a new accusation or threat. Sarah had started experiencing panic attacks. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, convinced she'd heard someone in their yard. Michael had installed additional security cameras, motion sensor lights, and had even discussed selling their house and moving. But they'd put their life savings into this home, and the market wasn't favorable for sellers. More importantly, Sarah refused to be driven from her home by a bully. The legal process moved with frustrating slowness. There were delays, postponements, and procedural hurdles. Karen's lawyer had filed motions to dismiss, claiming that Sarah and Emma were the actual harassers. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't so infuriating. Karen painted herself as the victim of a campaign of harassment by the family next door, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. During this time, Sarah had reconnected with Michael's sister, Rebecca. They'd always been close, but life had pulled them in different directions over the years. Rebecca had pursued a legal career, while Sarah had focused on raising her family. They'd kept in touch with occasional phone calls and holiday visits, but the intensity of the situation had brought them closer again. Sarah had poured out her frustrations to Rebecca during their phone conversations, carefully avoiding specific legal details, but sharing the emotional toll the situation was taking on Emma. Rebecca had been supportive and encouraging, reminding Sarah that the legal system, while slow, did ultimately tend to protect people from harassment. "The truth matters," Rebecca had told her. "When you get your day in court, make sure you have everything documented. Judges see through people who abuse the legal system to harass their neighbors. Sarah had taken that advice to heart. She'd created a binder with every police report, every false accusation, every piece of evidence showing Karen's pattern of harassment. She'd included photos of Emma's bruised wrist, statements from neighbors who'd witnessed Karen's behavior, and the doorbell camera footage that disproved Karen's claims about Michael threatening her. As the court date approached, Emma's anxiety reached new heights. She'd never been to court before, had never had to speak publicly about the trauma she'd experienced. Sarah had prepared her as best she could, explaining what to expect, how to answer questions clearly and honestly, and reminding her that telling the truth was all she needed to do. The night before the hearing, Emma had come to her parents' bedroom, unable to sleep. She'd curled up between Sarah and Michael like she used to do when she was little and had nightmares. "What if the judge doesn't believe us?" Emma had whispered. "What if Karen's lawyer makes me look like I'm lying?" Sarah had stroked her daughter's hair, fighting back her own tears. "The truth is on our side, sweetheart. We have evidence. We have witnesses, and you're the bravest person I know for standing up to this." The courthouse parking lot was nearly full when they arrived that morning. Sarah had taken the day off from her job at the elementary school where she worked as a teacher's aide. Michael had rearranged his work schedule to be there. Emma had dressed carefully in the conservative navy dress Sarah had helped her pick out, looking far older than her 17 years. As they walked through the metal detectors and security checkpoint, Sarah felt Emma's hand grip hers more tightly. The courthouse was an imposing building with high ceilings and marble floors that echoed with every footstep. People in business suits rushed past them, lawyers with rolling briefcases, families clutching papers and looking lost or worried. They found Courtroom 3B on the second floor and took seats on the hard wooden benches outside, waiting for their case to be called. Their lawyer, Patricia Chun, arrived moments later, her arms full of files and her expression professionally calm. "Remember what we discussed?" Patricia said, sitting down next to Emma. "Answer questions directly and honestly. If you don't understand something, ask for clarification. Don't let opposing counsel rattle you. You're not on trial here. Karen is the one whose behavior is being examined." Emma nodded, but Sarah could see the fear in her daughter's eyes. At 17, Emma should have been worried about college applications and prom dresses, not whether a judge would protect her from a dangerous neighbor. When Karen arrived with her lawyer, Sarah felt Emma stiffen beside her. Karen looked composed and professional in an expensive-looking suit, her hair perfectly styled, her expression neutral. It was a far cry from the wild-eyed woman who'd grabbed Emma's wrist and screamed threats. She looked like someone who could be trusted, someone reasonable, and that terrified Sarah more than Karen's anger ever had. Karen's lawyer, James Hartford, was exactly what Sarah had expected, confident to the point of arrogance, with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd made his career defending difficult clients, and he carried himself like someone who was used to winning. The bailiff called them into the courtroom, and Sarah's heart began to pound. This was it. Months of fear, documentation, and legal preparation had led to this moment. Everything depended on the next few hours. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah had imagined from watching legal dramas on television. There were rows of benches for spectators, though theirs was the only case scheduled for this time slot. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front of the room, with the witness stand to one side and tables for each party on either side of the central aisle. As they took their seats at the plaintiff's table, Sarah noticed Emma's hands shaking. She reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, trying to transmit strength she wasn't sure she possessed. The bailiff stood. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Rebecca Thornton." Sarah's mind registered the name a fraction of a second before the judge emerged from her chambers. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as she watched her sister-in-law, Michael's sister, take her seat at the bench. Rebecca's eyes swept the courtroom professionally, and for just a moment, the briefest instant, her gaze met Sarah's. Sarah's mind raced. She'd known Rebecca was a judge. They'd celebrated together when Rebecca had been appointed to the bench 3 years ago, but she'd been assigned to family court, not civil matters. There must have been a scheduling change, a case reassignment. Rebecca's expression gave nothing away as she settled into her chair and opened the case file. Michael had gone rigid beside her, and Sarah knew he'd recognized a sister too. Patricia Chin leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she read the nameplate on the bench. Karen and her lawyer seemed oblivious, focused on their own preparations. Judge Rebecca Thornton's voice was clear and professional as she called the court to order. This is case number CV 2025-3847, Emma Chun, petitioner versus Karen Mitchell, respondent, petition for restraining order. Counsel, please state your appearances for the record. Patricia stood. Patricia Chun for the petitioner, Your Honor. James Hartford for the respondent, Your Honor. Rebecca nodded, making notes on her tablet. I've reviewed the preliminary filings in this case. Ms. Chun, you may present your opening statement. As Patricia stood to speak, outlining the months of harassment Emma had endured, Sarah watched her sister-in-law's face. Rebecca's expression remained neutral and professional, giving no indication that she knew the people sitting at the plaintiff's table. But Sarah could see the slight tightness around Rebecca's eyes as Patricia described the escalating pattern of false accusations and threatening behavior. The hearing proceeded with Patricia calling Sarah to the stand first. Sarah had rehearsed her testimony countless times, but speaking in front of Rebecca added a surreal quality to the proceedings. She walked through the timeline of events from that first aggressive confrontation to the physical assault in their driveway. She presented the binder of evidence, explaining each document clearly and without embellishment. James Hartford's cross-examination was aggressive, as expected. He suggested that Sarah and her family had actually been the ones harassing Karen, that they'd manufactured evidence that Emma was a troubled teen acting out. But Sarah held her ground, referring repeatedly to the documented evidence, the police reports that had cleared her family of wrongdoing, and the witness statements from other neighbors. When Emma took the stand, Sarah's heart broke watching her daughter's hands tremble as she swore her oath. But Emma's voice, though quiet at first, grew stronger as she told her story. She described the fear of walking to her own mailbox, the nightmares her younger siblings had developed, the way she'd started to doubt herself under the constant barrage of accusations. I just wanted to practice my violin, Emma said at one point, her voice cracking. I worked so hard for my audition, and she made me feel like doing something I loved was wrong, like I didn't deserve to exist in my own home. Hartford tried to shake Emma's testimony, but she remained composed, answering his questions honestly and directly, just as Patricia had coached her. When he suggested that Emma was exaggerating the emotional impact of what he called a simple neighbor dispute, Emma looked him directly in the eye. Mr. Hartford, when someone grabs you hard enough to leave bruises and tells you that you're going to regret living in your own home, that's not a simple dispute. That's assault and terroristic threatening. I know the difference. Sarah saw Rebecca lean forward slightly, her attention focused intently on Emma. The pride Sarah felt in that moment warred with her concern about how Rebecca's family connection might complicate matters. The presentation of evidence took most of the morning. Patricia methodically walked through the documentation, the police reports that showed Karen's complaints had been unfounded, the doorbell camera footage that proved Michael had never threatened her, the medical photos of Emma's bruised wrist, the statements from 3 different neighbors who'd witnessed Karen's aggressive behavior. By the time they broke for lunch, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen's lawyer had tried to paint their family as the aggressors, but the facts simply didn't support his narrative. After lunch, it was Karen's turn to present her case. She took the stand with confidence, and Sarah watched as the woman who'd terrorized her family transformed into a victim before their eyes. Karen spoke in a soft, tremulous voice about how frightened she'd been of her neighbors, how Emma's music had given her migraines, how she'd felt threatened by Michael's aggressive presence. It was a masterful performance, and Sarah felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. What if the judge, even Rebecca, was swayed by Karen's act? What if all their evidence wasn't enough? But as Hartford led Karen through her testimony, Sarah noticed something. Karen was getting comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. Her answers became more elaborate, her stories more dramatic. She described scenarios that contradicted the documentary evidence, seeming to forget that Patricia had presented doorbell camera footage that disproved several of her claims. When Patricia began her cross-examination, Karen's composure started to crack. Patricia, with surgical precision, pointed out each contradiction between Karen's testimony and the physical evidence. When Karen claimed she'd been terrified of Michael, Patricia played the doorbell footage showing that Michael had never been anywhere near Karen's property on the dates she claimed to be threatened. Karen's voice grew sharper, her answers more defensive. She'd clearly expected her performance to be accepted at face value, and Patricia's methodical dismantling of her narrative was clearly frustrating her. Then Patricia asked the question that changed everything. "Ms. Mitchell, you filed a total of 17 police reports about the Chin family in the past 6 months. Of those 17 reports, how many resulted in any charges or citations against them?" Karen's jaw tightened. "The police in this town are incompetent. They didn't take my complaints seriously. That's not what I asked. How many of your 17 reports resulted in any finding of wrongdoing by the Chin family?" "None, but—" "And you filed a false report claiming that Michael Chun had threatened you, despite video evidence showing no such interaction ever occurred, correct?" "I was mistaken about the date." "You filed multiple reports claiming Emma Chun and her friends were dealing drugs from their driveway, resulting in a search of their home that found nothing illegal, correct?" Karen's face was flushing red now. "Those kids are sneaky." "Ms. Mitchell, yes or no? Did the search find any evidence of drug activity?" "No." Rebecca had been taking notes throughout, her expression still professionally neutral. But Sarah noticed her sister-in-law's pen had stilled. Patricia continued, "And on September 15th, you physically grabbed Emma Chun in her own driveway and told her she would regret the day she moved here, did you not? That girl was being disrespectful. Did you or did you not grab her wrist hard enough to leave bruises visible in these photographs?" Patricia held up the medical documentation. Karen's lawyer stood to object, but before he could speak, something shifted in Karen. Sarah saw it happen. The mask of the frightened victim fell away, and the real Karen, the one they'd been dealing with for months, emerged. That spoiled little brat and her parents think they can do whatever they want. Karen's voice had risen, sharp and angry. They moved into this neighborhood and acted like they owned it. She plays that screeching violin at all hours. Their friends park in front of my house. They put up those tacky decorations. Ms. Mitchell, her lawyer was saying, urgently, "I strongly advise you to—" But Karen wasn't listening. She'd turned to face Emma directly, pointing at her. "You think you can just waltz into my neighborhood and disturb my peace? You're nothing but an entitled little—" "Ms. Mitchell." Rebecca's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "You will face forward and address the court, not the petitioner." But Karen was beyond control now. 6 months of maintained composure had shattered, and the rage she'd been channeling into calculated harassment poured out unchecked. She turned toward the judge's bench, her face twisted with anger. "This whole thing is ridiculous. Those people are the problem, not me. And if this court isn't going to do something about them, then I will." Sarah saw it before her mind could fully process what was happening. Karen reached into her purse, and the metallic gleam caught the light as she pulled out a small handgun. Time seemed to slow. Emma gasped. Patricia started to rise from her chair. The bailiff moved toward Karen, his hand going his own weapon. And Karen, her face now completely transformed by rage, pointed the gun in Emma's direction. "I'm done being victimized by these people." "Gun," the bailiff shouted, drawing his weapon. "Put down now." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Michael had grabbed Emma, pulling her down behind their table. Sarah felt frozen, unable to move. Her eyes locked on the weapon in Karen's hand. Rebecca's voice rang out, commanding and clear. "Karen Mitchell, put that weapon down immediately. Bailiff, secure the respondent." But Karen wasn't putting the gun down. She was screaming now, waving the weapon erratically. "You're all going to listen to me. I'm the victim here. They ruined my life, and nobody cares." 2 more bailiffs rushed into the courtroom. The first bailiff was circling behind Karen, his weapon trained on her. Ma'am, put the gun down now. Put down. Karen's lawyer had backed away from their table, his hands raised, his face pale. The court reporter had ducked behind her desk, and Rebecca remained at her bench, standing now, her voice steady despite the chaos. Ms. Mitchell, you are in direct violation of multiple laws. Put the weapon down, and we can resolve this without anyone getting hurt. For a long moment, Karen stood there, the gun still in her hand, her breathing ragged. Then, as if suddenly realizing what she'd done, she looked down at the weapon. The rage drained from her face, replaced by something like panic. The gun clattered to the floor, and the bailiffs moved in immediately, forcing Karen to the ground and handcuffing her. Her voice had changed again, now pleading and desperate. I just wanted them to leave. I just wanted peace. Why wouldn't anyone help me? The aftermath of those terrifying moments seemed to last forever and pass in an instant simultaneously. Additional court security arrived. The police were called. Karen was removed from the courtroom in handcuffs, still protesting that she was the victim, that she'd only wanted to make people listen to her. Emma was shaking in Michael's arms, and Sarah finally found herself able to move, rushing to wrap both of them in her embrace. They stood there, a family united by trauma and relief, while the courtroom slowly returned to order. Rebecca had called a recess, disappearing into her chambers with the attorneys. When court resumed 30 minutes later, her face was stern, her voice carrying an authority that made clear this was not merely Judge Rebecca Thornton speaking, but the full weight of the judicial system. Let the record reflect that Karen Mitchell brought a firearm into this courthouse in direct violation of state law. Rebecca began. She produced that weapon in open court while legal proceedings were in session, brandishing it in a threatening manner toward the petitioner and potentially others in this courtroom. This represents not only criminal conduct, but a direct assault on the integrity of the judicial process itself. She paused, her eyes moving to where Karen had been sitting, now empty. The respondent has been taken into custody. She will face immediate criminal charges, including bringing a weapon into a courthouse, terroristic threatening, assault with a deadly weapon, and criminal contempt of court. The district attorney has been notified and will be filing formal charges. Karen's lawyer, Hartford, looked shaken. Your Honor, I had no knowledge that my client... Rebecca held up a hand. Mr. Hartford, I'm not suggesting you did. However, your client's actions have conclusively demonstrated the very behavior that brought us here today. The pattern of harassment, the false allegations, the physical assault. All of this has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt by her own conduct in this courtroom. Rebecca turned her attention to the Chin family. As for the matter before the court, I'm granting the petition for a restraining order in its entirety. Karen Mitchell is ordered to have no contact whatsoever with Emma Chun, Sarah Chun, Michael Chen, or any member of their family. She is prohibited from coming within 500 feet of the Chin residence. She is prohibited from any form of direct or indirect contact, including through third parties, electronic communication, or social media. She continued, furthermore, given the severity of Ms. Mitchell's conduct, I'm issuing an additional protective order that will remain in effect regardless of the outcome of her criminal proceedings. The Chin family has endured months of systematic harassment, culminating in an act of violence and terroristic threatening in my courtroom. This behavior is unacceptable, it is criminal, and it will not be tolerated. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Emma was crying too, but these were tears of relief, of release, of finally being heard and protected. Rebecca wasn't finished. I want to address something for the record. The petitioner in this case is 17 years old. She is a minor who should be focused on her education, her music, her future. Instead, she spent 6 months living in fear, having her reputation attacked, being physically assaulted, and ultimately being threatened with a deadly weapon. All because her neighbor decided to wage a campaign of harassment against her family. Her voice grew stronger. This court takes such matters extremely seriously. No one has the right to terrorize their neighbors, to file false police reports, to physically assault a teenager, or to bring weapons into a courthouse to intimidate witnesses. Ms. Mitchell's actions represent everything that is wrong with how some people choose to resolve disputes. Rather than acting like a reasonable adult, she chose escalation, harassment, and ultimately violence. Rebecca looked directly at Emma. Ms. Chun, I want you to know that what happened to you was wrong. It was not your fault. You had every right to practice your violin in your own home. You had every right to live without fear. And you showed tremendous courage in coming forward to seek the protection of this court. I hope that today marks the beginning of healing for you and your family. Then, Rebecca did something Sarah had never seen a judge do in any courtroom, real or televised. She addressed the family directly, her voice softer, but no less clear. The Chin family has shown remarkable restraint throughout this ordeal. They documented everything properly, they sought help through appropriate channels, and they refused to respond to provocation with more provocation. That kind of dignity under duress is commendable. Michael squeezed Sarah's hand, and she squeezed back, both of them watching Rebecca with a mixture of gratitude and awe. Rebecca concluded the formal portion of the hearing, setting dates for follow-up proceedings and outlining the terms of the restraining order in detail. When she finally adjourned the court, Sarah felt as though she could breathe fully for the first time in months. As the courtroom cleared, Rebecca asked the bailiff to let the Chun family remain for a moment. Once the doors closed and they were alone, she stepped down from the bench, and the professional distance she'd maintained throughout the proceedings fell away. "Michael," she said, and her voice was the voice of his sister, not Judge Thornton. "Sarah, Emma, I am so sorry you went through this." Michael's voice was thick with emotion. "Becca, how did you even get assigned to this case?" "Judge Wilson had a medical emergency this morning. I was reassigned to cover his docket." She shook her head. "When I saw the case file, I almost recused myself immediately. But then I read through everything, all the evidence, all the documented harassment, and I realized that recusing myself would only delay your protection. So I consulted with the chief judge, disclosed the family relationship, and got clearance to hear the case with the understanding that every decision I made would be subject to additional scrutiny." She looked at Emma. "Sweetheart, I want you to know that I didn't rule in your favor because you're my niece. I ruled in your favor because the evidence was overwhelming and because what that woman did in my courtroom in front of witnesses proved everything you'd been saying about her. Any judge would have ruled the same way." Emma nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Aunt Rebecca." Rebecca pulled Emma into a hug. "You are so brave, so incredibly brave, and I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself and your family. What happened in Courtroom 3B that day was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a reminder that bullies come in all forms, that harassment can happen anywhere, even in quiet suburban neighborhoods. It was proof that documentation matters, that following proper channels matters, and that sometimes justice really does prevail." Karen Mitchell's actions didn't just earn her criminal charges and a restraining order, they became a cautionary tale about what happens when someone believes they're above the rules, above consequences. She'd counted on intimidation to silence the Chin family, on the legal system being too slow or too indifferent to protect them. She'd even brought a weapon into a courthouse, so convinced of her righteousness that she thought threatening a teenager in front of a judge would somehow help her cause. She'd been wrong on every count. In the weeks that followed, Karen was charged with multiple felonies. Her lawyer worked out a plea deal that included jail time, mandatory mental health treatment, and a permanent criminal record. She was required to sell her house and move from the neighborhood. The Chin family finally had the peace they'd been fighting for. Emma went on to join the state orchestra, her confidence slowly rebuilding. The younger twins, Jake and Lily, stopped having nightmares. Michael and Sarah could finally relax in their own home. And Rebecca remained the steady presence she'd always been in their lives, though they all agreed that their next family gathering would be significantly less stressful than that day in court. But the story doesn't end with just one family's victory. It carries a larger question that echoes for all of us. How many people in your community might be suffering in silence, being terrorized by neighbors, bullies, or abusers because they don't think anyone will believe them or help them? How many MS are out there, afraid to practice their passions, afraid to exist in their own homes, because someone has decided to wage a campaign of harassment against them? The Chin family story is a reminder that documentation matters, that persistence matters, that speaking up matters, even when it's terrifying. They could have given up at any point. They could have moved away, let Karen win, accepted that this was just how things were. But they didn't. They fought back through legal channels, they gathered their evidence, and they demanded protection. And when the moment of crisis came, when Karen revealed her true nature in the most dramatic and dangerous way possible, justice was right there, sitting at the bench, ready to protect them. If you or someone you know is experiencing harassment, stalking, or domestic violence, please know that you are not alone and that help is available. Document everything. Keep texts, emails, voicemails, photographs, and video evidence. File police reports, even if you think nothing will come of them. Seek legal advice about protective orders. Tell people you trust what's happening. The Chin family's courage to stand up and seek legal protection not only saved them, but potentially prevented Karen from harming others in the future. Your voice matters. Your safety matters. Your peace in your own home matters. Don't wait for things to escalate to crisis levels. Seek help now. Contact local domestic violence resources, legal aid organizations, or law enforcement. And remember, just as Rebecca told Emma that day in court, what's happening to you is not your fault, and you deserve to live without fear. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Let them know that justice, while sometimes slow, does exist. Let them know that courage can take many forms, from a teenage girl standing up in court to tell her truth, to a judge who puts on her robe and protects those who need protection most. What will you do today to stand up against harassment and bullying? Will you document it? Report it? Support someone who's going through it? Your actions, like the Chen family's actions, might be exactly what's needed to stop a bully in their tracks. Justice was served in Courtroom 3B, but the fight for safety and dignity continues everywhere. Be part of the solution. Be someone's hope. Be the reason someone else finds the courage to stand up and say, "Enough." Remember, the scales of justice may move slowly, but they do move, and sometimes they're held by someone who loves you.